Taxation without representation. Utah's government was established as a representative democracy, with legislators pledged to enhance freedom, justice, and equality for every citizen. A government of the people, by the people, for the people. The will of the majority should guide the representative when voting on any bill. The will of the majority should only be ignored when the best information available or the national interest prove the bill's shortcomings. The representative plus the will of the majority equals beneficial legislation. Unfortunately, bills that benefit citizens often don't even make it to a vote. And why? The answer is simple. Utah citizens are not represented by their legislators on critical issues that affect our lives. This is not representative democracy. Local and out-of-state special interests with no right of representation are often given priority and too often at the citizens' expense. Representatives plus special interests equals compromised legislation. The result is Utah has the poorest public schools in the nation. According to the National Lung Association, the Greater Salt Lake area is in 8th place for cities with the worst polluted air. Our gun violence epidemic includes a scandalous rate of teenage suicide. 60,000 poor citizens were cheated of health insurance for 5 years, and they were only rescued by the Obamacare requirements. Utah serves as a dump for out-of-state radioactive waste, and the pollution-generating inland port is disliked by the vast majority. Finally, there is no plan in place to address the threat of climate change. Each one of these issues has received too little or no legislative action. These special interests, members of the American Legislative Exchange Council, known as ALEC, the Charles Koch Foundation, coal and oil interests, and the National Rifle Association have no right to be represented. Yet, too many legislators make sure that these special interests are met first while turning their backs on issues that affect and protect citizens' lives. State House and Senate members have forgotten they represent our citizens exclusively. Taxes pay legislators' salaries, so citizens have every right to demand reasonable, beneficial legislation that expresses the will of the majority, an authentic representative democracy. But this we know, 80% of campaign donations from legislators come from out-of-state special interests, often with strings attached. Each legislator can average $10,000 per session, while the Senate President and the House Speaker can take in much more for each session because they control which bills make it to the floor for a vote. Too often, these illegitimate bills can actually threaten the lives of Utah citizens. Many citizens' organizations have formed in the state because of failed representation. Following are videos from some of these organizations.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Brian Minch. I'm the president and founder of Utah Physicians for a Healthy Environment. Like many of you, I'm an enthusiastic breather of air. And that's the reason why I want to talk to you today. In 1847, my pioneer ancestors entered the valley and declared this is the place. 173 years later, our political and business leaders have declared, again, this is the place to make a lot of money. This is not the place to breathe. That's a little different twist than our pioneers' ancestors applied to the situation. Frederick Douglass, the famous 19th century statesman and abolitionist. I want to quote him again. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have the exact measure of the injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. Quietly submitting to the inland port will bring us that, quote, exact measure in the form of the worst injustice and wrong that Salt Lake City might see in our modern history. We now live in a world where evidence, science, facts, truth, logic, common sense, and objective reality have all become endangered species. We don't just live in an age of normalizing alternative facts. The very stable geniuses on Utah's Capitol Hill live in an alternative universe. We also live in a world where the rich and powerful and the politically connected write public policy to increase their advantage and their wealth at the expense of everyone else. And there is no better example of both of these pernicious trends than the dirty energy inland port. Behind a smokescreen of words like sustainable, the greenest ever, net zero, and electrified, the port's Pied Pipers want you to think that the second coming of the Green New Deal is upon us. But in the real world, it's just a zombie return of the brown old deal. We are driving full throttle to the edge of the cliff where the climate crisis will imperil every person on Earth. But the port's Pied Pipers say, we don't need to worry about that. We can ship even more dirty energy out of the state, more coal, oil, and gas, more tar sands and oil shale, and it won't accelerate the climate crisis. They might as well ask us to believe in Bigfoot. The port's Pied Pipers want us to trust them that adding 10,000 more diesel semi-trucks to the valley, 20,000 more computers, hundreds of more plane trips, dozens more smoking train locomotives won't affect the air you breathe or your health. What they're asking us is to pretend that air pollution is just pixie dust, and it doesn't matter. Well, air pollution is hardly pixie dust. It's deadly. It matters. All of it. There is no safe level of air pollution you can be exposed to. Now, every bit of air pollution is a death sentence to someone or a trip to the hospital for someone else. No one can escape it, not newborns, not school children, not pregnant mothers, not the elderly, the sick, or afflicted. A recent study, in fact, showed that 99% of the deaths due to air pollution occur in communities that meet the EPA standards. In other words, the air pollution problem that we have is not just winter inversions. It's year-round. It's on days when the air seems clear. And the official government warning is, it's green. We're all good to go. Within 15 minutes after inhaling these tiny particles, those particles show up in your bloodstream. And then shortly after, in virtually any organ in your body, any cell in your body can be penetrated by these little invaders. We know the air pollution you have breathed in January, much of it is still inside your body in April, and it's still causing biologic damage. Between 1,000 and 2,000 Utahns die every year due to our air pollution, and more will lose their lives because of the pollution from this port. How many more lives is it okay to lose before this becomes immoral? 10? 50? 500? For some pesticides, brain damage has been found at the lowest detectable dose. What this means clinically was revealed in a study showing pregnant women exposed to high levels of pyrethroids. That's the kind of insecticide that was commonly used against mosquitoes. Those children scored significantly lower on intelligence tests 3 years later. The brain damage was comparable to what occurs with lead toxicity. Think Flint, Michigan. The inland port will reprise the tragedy of Flint, Michigan throughout the Salt Lake Valley. For Salt Lake Valley residents, the most important place to reduce chemical usage is in the valley itself. Mosquito control, as it is all too often done, even in Salt Lake City, cannot be written off as safe, especially in neighborhoods near the port. It is yet another ugly, inconvenient truth of the inland port. Now, because this is a church, let's talk about charity, empathy, morality, and family values. There is no greater immorality and no greater contradiction of family values than a public policy that enriches the few at the expense, the suffering, the illness, and the deaths of the many. Thank you.
My name is John Benyon. I was initiated in school administration in upstate New York, mainly. Brighton was primarily a Jewish community and was very supportive of public schools. Every year, the residents of the district came out, heard the budget proposal, and there was always a tax increase attached to it. In the 10 years I was there, the budget passed every time, first try, and usually by a margin of about 2-1, even though everybody realized it would mean a property tax increase. The culture there was that the residents wanted an outstanding public school system, and they knew that you tend to get what you pay for, and so they were quite willing to have their taxes raised every year to make sure that the educational system was virtually second to none.
When I came back to Utah in Provo, I found a very different mindset about supporting education. I found in my first year that we were $900,000 in the red and either had to raise taxes or make some significant cuts. And the support of the Provo schools generally was much less than I'd been accustomed to in Brighton. That tax failed the first time, which shocked me. I really went through a cultural disconnect compared to what I'd been used to in New York. We tried a second time, somewhat lowered the amount. That failed as well. So I was quite discouraged. When I got to Salt Lake 5 years later, there was somewhat more support. The property values in Salt Lake City were higher than in Provo because of all the downtown properties. So we were in better shape. What I found was, and concluded was, that the rhetoric about supporting schools and valuing public education in Utah was not that different than in New York. And I found that taxpayers in Utah were very reluctant to have their taxes increased, even in support of education. Even though some surveys say, would you be willing to have your taxes go up if you knew they would go right into the schools and improve the schools? The answer in the abstract was yes. Yeah, we'd be willing to do that. But whenever it comes to voting, either directly or through the legislature, higher taxes in support of education, it's rare in Utah that such referenda are successful. Utah, when I got there, was either last or next to last in pupil expenditure. That was way back in 1980. And that's continued to pretty much be the case from that time to now. We are dead last now in pupil expenditure. That is mainly because class sizes are higher than in the average across the nation. It's because teacher salaries are not the worst, but well below, I think it's fair to say, the national average. And the very lack of support services that I'd been used to in New York. In the district in New York, we had a full-time physical education teacher and music teacher in each of the elementary schools, and a half-time or three-quarters time art teacher, and a school nurse. None of that you'll find in Utah. We had a stronger support system for special ed, special needs youngsters, more psychologists, more social workers than is the case in Utah.
So our legislature is not responsive to the will of the people. And that is the biggest obstacle, I believe, to saving lives. My name is Terry Gilfillan. I am the board chair for the Gun Violence Prevention Center of Utah. The Gun Violence Prevention Center of Utah has been in existence since the late 90s and early 2000. And the mission of our organization is to prevent the tragedy of gun violence through education and reasonable regulation of firearms. Access to firearms is big in this state, particularly for people who may not be criminal in nature or anything, but have firearms in their home. And when they reach a point that they are potentially having issues where their mental health might be unstable, or there's life situations affect their depression or whatever, they have easy access to firearms. So another thing is that in our state we also have a high rate of homicides by intimate partners. Educating our legislators about the need to do something to curb gun violence in our state. So one of the bills that came out last year is called an extreme risk protective order. And what that does, and what it will do for our state if it is passed, is help people who might be at risk of harming themselves or others, where a family member or a police officer can request from a judge to have that person's firearms removed for that period of time when they're in crisis. Another bill was also introduced that we have been championed for years, is to expand the universal background check system to include the current loopholes, which means the current loopholes are private sales at gun shows and online. However, we know that at gun shows and online, private sellers can make arrangements to sell their firearms to someone without a background check. And so if you are someone who knows that you might not pass a background check, there are places in our state, ways to get firearms. So that's a problem. And I feel like we as an organization are really hopeful that our legislature will take a look at that. The unfortunate thing is we've had mass shootings all across this country involving children, people enjoying life at a theater or other events, and those seem to spark a lot of interest in making sure that people who shouldn't have firearms don't get them. But yet our legislature and our Congress has still not passed a universal background check that would close those loopholes that currently exist. I believe after Sandy Hook in 2012, a group of moms marched on the Capitol and demanded that this pass our legislature. It passed the House, went to the Senate, and died by one vote. We've had several bills, I believe 7 to 9 bills last year, that were introduced into the legislature that would curb some of these issues. The extreme risk protective order, the universal background check, safe storage, which is another thing. We're seeing young kids getting access to their parents' firearms and committing suicide. That's a huge thing. And so we're asking people to be responsible gun owners and store their firearms in a place where someone, like a child, can't get access to them, or someone who might be in crisis in the home. So these are measures that we feel our legislature should take up. But last year, they didn't. Several of those bills, in fact, the majority of those bills that were introduced didn't even get a hearing in a committee. I think our biggest challenge is our state legislature. So our legislature is not responsive to the will of the people. And that is the biggest obstacle, I believe.
My name is Dita Seed, and I work with the Center for Biological Diversity and the Stop the Polluting Port Coalition. The Stop the Polluting Port Coalition is a loose coalition that's made up of, I think we have now about 15 different groups that are associated with the coalition, and we're working basically to stop the proposed polluting port from being built within Salt Lake City boundaries. The first thing is understanding what the port is, and honestly, it has not been very well defined by the policymakers, by the legislators who are promoting it. But essentially, what we understand they're proposing to do is to build 34 million square feet of warehouse space on land that's currently undeveloped on the north side of I-80. And in addition to that, there's some discussion about building a second rail yard, intermodal rail yard, out in the northwest quadrant. Right now, there's currently a facility operated by Union Pacific that is not, it's underutilized. So, this whole concept of an inland port was cooked up by people who really hadn't thought it through very carefully. They were just excited about the money-making opportunities, and they didn't really examine the environmental consequences really at all. And so now, what we've learned as of late is that the newly hired Port Board director, or Port Authority director, a fellow named Jack Hedge, is basically agreeing with all of our concerns. He's saying, he has experience, he worked for the Port of LA, and he's coming to Utah saying, well, we don't want, I'm coming here because I want to prevent what happened in LA from happening here. Yeah. And, the answer to that is like, well, don't build it, Mr. Hedge is saying, well, your concerns about the impacts of water quality, your concerns about the air quality harm that will come from this are all valid. Those are all valid concerns. So it's really, we think now that there's recognition, even among the people who are orchestrating this, of the harms, that's really going to change the dynamic and allows us an opportunity to stop maybe the whole thing. The pollution alone should stop it, and it's really appalling that nobody, when they were thinking about doing this, asked any of the hard questions about what building an inland port would do to our air quality. And I think one of the reasons why this happened in the way that it did, with people initially not understanding the impact, is because nobody really knew what an inland port is. And so we've been researching examples of inland ports from around the world, and they're all dirty. They're all polluting. There's no clean, and the port director says this too, there's no clean, green port anywhere in the world right now. And so, as we started to uncover this research, we were able to counter this narrative had been fed to elected officials, including Salt Lake City council members and the mayor, about how great it would be to have this giant warehouse complex. But the reality is, for example, there's one of the biggest inland ports in the United States is in Elwood, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, and it's devastated that community. They subsidized the development of the inland port, just as we're being asked to do. And the consequence has been truck traffic that has completely destroyed their quality of life. People are getting killed by trucks. The roads are deteriorating, and there's air pollution, and the jobs are terrible. There was an article in the New Republic last spring that described, some of the horrors of the Elwood, Illinois port, and in particular, the fact that the jobs associated with it are called perma-temping jobs. So they're temporary jobs where you don't get any benefits, and you're just kind of shuttled from employer to employer. And it's really, really bad news for the workers. So anyway, we learned about what's happening in other ports, and we're able to bring that back to our community and say, we don't really want this. We have a very low unemployment rate here. We don't need these really poorly paid, in some cases dangerous jobs that are associated with an inland port. And the air pollution consequences of this could be huge. But just from the diesel-powered machinery that's associated with these types of facilities. So, for example, warehouses are serviced by trucks. Trucks are powered by diesel. A conservative estimate from what they're planning, what we've seen that they're planning to build right now, is that would be like over 3,000 additional truck trips onto I-80 every day, not to mention the cars associated with the operation. So it's a huge new source of mobile pollution. In other parts of the country where there are inland ports, in particular in Southern California, the area around these ports, these inland ports, it's called a diesel death zone, because the epidemiological data shows that people are suffering disproportionate, instances of respiratory problems and cancers, and it's just this litany of horror, and it's because of the diesel pollution from all the trucks associated with all the warehouses that are a part of the inland port. So that's a whole set of area of concern.
My name is Tom Moyer. I'm the state coordinator for Citizens Climate Lobby. We're an international organization, nonpartisan grassroots, lobbying on climate change to bring Republicans and Democrats together on market-based solutions. We work across the aisle equally well with Democrats and Republicans. 6 chapters in Utah, about 3,000 members, and we have about 150,000 members internationally. There's places like California that are moving really aggressively to cut carbon emissions, and there's places like Utah that are laggards. But politically, we are viewed as a head-turner, tipping point kind of state. Among red states, we are one of the most pragmatic. We've done things that other states can't do on immigration, on religious freedom, and we hope to be that kind of state on climate change as well. So our group, Citizens Climate Lobby, has always been focused mostly at the federal level. Yeah. And we know that we have to influence people at the state level in order to get action at the federal level. So we've done a lot of work, a lot of outreach to businesses and state legislators, trying to move the politics. In the last couple of years, we've made a more explicit effort to focus on the Utah state legislature. But we passed, 2 years ago in Utah, we passed the first ever climate resolution in a red state. And that was it was originated by students at Logan High School. They wrote the first draft. This was 3 years ago. They had meetings on the Hill. They got a Democratic senator to sponsor it and run it. And then they got a Republican House member, whose name is Becky Edwards, to lead on it and run it as hers. There are countries like France and Sweden who have already completely decarbonized their electricity supply and are working hard on the harder sectors, transportation and heating. In Norway, more than half of all cars sold now are electric vehicles. United States, we're sort of middle of the pack on that. We're by far far from the worst.
So I'm Dr. Scott Williams, and I'm the Executive Director of the Healthy Environment Alliance of Utah. We're known as HEAL Utah. We focus on 3 primary environmental areas. One is air quality, one is energy and climate change, and the other one is radioactive waste. So on the radioactive waste front, we have 3 main things that we're working on right now. One is Energy Solutions' proposal to dispose of depleted uranium out at their site at Clive, Utah. Depleted uranium is a form of waste that starts out at low levels and becomes more and more radioactive over time. So if they bring it in, they'll say that it isn't very toxic, but then as it sits out there, it'll get more and more and more toxic over thousands of years. So what we've been trying to do is to oppose their application for a permit to bring this waste into the state. This is waste that results from the creation of nuclear fuel for nuclear power plants. Utah doesn't have any nuclear power plants, and so we don't think Utah should have to be the place where this waste gets disposed. The legislature has been working with Energy Solutions to try to help make this easier for them, but ultimately the decision is that in the Department of Environmental Quality, and so we have to follow the rules of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But Energy Solutions frequently tries to run bills that do end runs around those requirements. So that's what we'll be watching for. We don't know of any bills right now, but last year there was one, the year before there was one, and they kind of pop up by surprise. Second issue we work on is a proposal to build a nuclear power plant in southern Idaho that about 25 cities and towns in Utah are considering subscribing to that nuclear power. It would be the first time nuclear power would be brought into the state. This is not something the legislature has jurisdiction over, but they've been passing resolutions supporting this idea. And so we are going to be also watching for any bills that might come up that would make it easier for this to happen. But mostly we're working with cities and towns to try to get their city councils to vote against this proposal. And then the last nuclear waste issue that we work on is the proposal to reopen Yucca Mountain as the nation's permanent repository of all of the nation's high-level nuclear waste, which is what's left over after you take the fuel rods out of a nuclear power plant. It's very highly radioactive, it's very toxic, and they want to move all of it across the whole country to Yucca Mountain, Nevada, and that means about 80% of it would be traveling on the roads and rails through Utah. For about 30 to 40 years, there'd be several truck or train loads a day that would come through Utah, and one accident could result in significant exposure to high-level radioactive waste along I-15 or along the Union Pacific Railroad corridor. Again, this is a national issue. There are national bills that we're working on with this, and the legislature doesn't have direct jurisdiction over this, but we would like them to take a stronger position. Previous governors, from Governor Matheson to Governor Herbert to Governor Huntsman, have all opposed this, and we'd like to keep that going so that this doesn't become a risk to the citizens of Utah.
None of Utah's problems have a firm solution in place because of special interest money. Most states have limits on campaign donations. Utah is one of 4 states that has none. Hawaii is the only state that limits campaign funding to state funds exclusively, with each candidate given an equal amount. This should be the goal of any representative democracy worthy of the name. Failure to provide enlightened solutions threatens the health, safety, education, and opportunity for each citizen. Taxation earns us the right to honest representation, and legislation should benefit Utah citizens exclusively. It is time for Utah citizens to stand up and demand well-funded public schools, clean air, effective gun regulation, health insurance for all, elimination of an inland port, protection of Prop 4, the anti-gerrymandering amendment, and most important, a plan for a sustainable way of living that respects the planet and all of life. None of these problems can be too expensive to solve. And this should be the goal of any real democracy. A shared dedication will achieve the kind of community that solves the needs of the people and not special interests.
Although Utahns, at least in my experience, have always been quite conservative. And thinking, I should have mentioned this, that in New York, the view was that public services are an extension of the community or the state. And that the government is not some independent agency out there unrelated to the people. That it's a way of collectively supporting things that privately most people couldn't do themselves. I had many people in Brighton, New York, tell me, we moved into this district because of the quality of the schools, and we're quite willing to pay higher property taxes. Whereas in Utah, I found that there's more of a disconnect between government and a sense of government reflecting all of us, and investments collectively through taxes enable us to promote values that are important to us. The government is more of a foreign entity that sort of wants our money to do things that we don't identify with. It's a very different philosophy. And that's been frustrating to me in Utah, as though the government were unrelated to the citizens generally, and public services that can be provided that improve the general welfare of everybody. It's a very different philosophy, and that was part of my cultural shock coming from the East and the Midwest back to Utah.
Yeah.